Hello and welcome. In the 1960s, something happened. Something really interesting. Well, as far as I'm concerned, interesting. The pitch of women's voices dropped. But why? Why did that happen in the 1960s? Well, in the 1960s, more and more women were entering the workforce in a very serious way. Up to that point, we had been part of the workforce, but not in such large numbers. Now we were entering the workforce and we were gaining seats at the table. We were becoming leaders. We were being accepted onto boards. We were rising up through the ranks in academia. So why did women's voices drop in pitch? Because we were with men. So the majority of people that we worked with at that time were men. Now, men's voices are lower in pitch. That's partly because of anatomy, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But there was an unconscious correlation that happened in our minds that these men were in positions of power. They had jobs that really kind of meant something. They had titles that meant something. They could make decisions that impacted other people. They were being paid more than we had been being paid in their workforce up until that point. And from a biological standpoint, we were seeing that these men were fathering children. Now, from a biology perspective, fathering multiple children means you are in authority. You have a position of power in the animal world. And so our animal brains were kind of going, these guys are getting more of the stuff that we would like. And one of the ways that we can do that, one of the ways we can be taken more seriously, one of the ways we can get our voices heard is by lowering the tones, the pitch of our voice. Now, today, I'm going to talk about why we tend to hate our voices, and it's pretty ubiquitous across the board. Most people would say, I don't like the sound of my own voice. And we're going to talk about the 5 things that you can do to tweak your voice and develop a better relationship with it, and also to create a greater impact every time you speak. So why is that important? Why is it important to know that we can tweak our voice, that we can change our voice, that we can create different kinds of impact? Well, one of the big reasons for looking at this and creating a better relationship with our voice is actually our voice is very much part of our personal brand. And people talk about personal brand all the time, whether you work in a corporate space or whether you're an entrepreneur. But really knowing your personal brand is vital to helping your career progress or your business grow. And people talk about personal brand in terms of the things that you might wear or the photography you might use if you're an entrepreneur and you have a website, or the kinds of work that you might do. But actually, for me, your voice is very much part of your personal brand. Because if you think about it, you can change your hair, you can change your clothes, you could change the style of the way that you're working. But the one thing that is consistent, the one thing that is always there is your voice. So we want your voice to be congruent with the rest of your personal brand. And there's a really, really classic scenario where personal brand and the look of somebody did not match their voice. And if you've ever seen, and I absolutely adore this film, if you've ever seen Singing in the Rain, there's the moment where the very beautiful silent movie actress is now being asked to speak because movies are moving into the talkies. And she has a very broad New York accent, which is actually quite high in pitch, and it doesn't really match how she looks. And so they're trying to tutor her to sound a little different. But if our voices don't match our personal brand, then there's a misalignment, and it's a little bit harder for our audience to absorb the content of what we're saying. It's a little bit harder for our audience to really listen to us and take us seriously. So the more congruent we are in terms of how we look and how we sound and the content we're saying, the greater the impact we're going to have. But not only that, we are perceived as more competent by our audience. So they think of us as more of an expert if everything is aligned. If things are misaligned, if we don't look and sound and our content isn't congruent, then the perception is we're not as expert as we could be. And therefore we're not listened to as often as we should. So people tend to sort of step away from our ideas or don't absorb them as readily as they might if everything was congruent. So when I was working with a client about a year ago now, she arrived because she hated the sound of her own voice. That, by her own admission, when she arrived, she's like, I hate it when I speak. I don't like it. It sounds shrill. People don't listen to me, but I know what I've got to say is really valuable. Now, she was very senior in an education company and she was a tech analyst. So she was looking at the data, which was basically determining where the company should invest, what they should do next, and how what they were producing was impacting on their clients. She had an incredibly important role. So it was vital that she was able to get that information across to the rest of the company so they could make really sound decisions about what to do next and where to invest their money. She felt like the very senior exec team, apart from the CEO, weren't really listening to her content, and she felt that her peers had a tendency to speak over her. So when we analysed what was going on with her voice, we found 3 things that weren't congruent with the rest of her brand. The first thing was that her pace was a little bit too fast. And I always hesitate to say too something, too high, too low, too fast, too slow. But her pace was at such a pace that it was a little bit difficult to absorb all the information, especially when she was telling us about anything technical. So we realized that the pace of her speaking was just a bit too fast. It needed to be reined in slightly. The second thing that was not on her side and was not congruent with her brand was that she had a breathy voice quality. So I'm going to try to imitate a breathy voice quality. And I want you to think about the moment when Marilyn Monroe sings Happy Birthday to Mr. President. So it's that kind of soft voice. Great for intimate conversations. Not so good if you're really trying to convince people that you know what you're talking about. So I'm going to stop doing that because it's quite tiring. Breathy voices are very difficult to create impact with. You can't get much volume with them. They're designed for small, intimate conversations. It can sound a little bit sexy at work, a bit sexual. And obviously that's not what you want. You don't want to have you using a flirty voice at work. So Mary's voice was, the pace was a little bit too fast and the vocal quality was breathy. And then on top of that, her pitch was a little bit high. Now, she was a very small woman, and anatomically, that's going to impact on her tone of voice. But actually, the biggest thing that was impacting her pitch was tension. She was very tense. She didn't like the sound of her voice. She was worried about making an impact. She felt she hadn't been making an impact in the few months before we were working together. And so everything here in her vocal tract was tense. And that tension creates a higher pitch. So we started to work together to find her optimum pitch. Now, everybody has an optimum pitch. The optimum pitch is the point where your vocal tract is relaxed and your voice is the most comfortable it can be. And you could probably talk at that pitch most of the day and not really tire. If I was to artificially raise the pitch of my voice, my muscles are now having to work really hard. And over time, that's going to be really tiring. And equally, if I pressed my larynx down, so that's the part of the vocal tract that creates your voice, my larynx is being pushed down. If I tried to speak at this pitch all day long, it wouldn't take very long before I started to get really tired because my muscles are working artificially to either raise the larynx to increase the pitch or push it down to lower the pitch. So tension release is a really important part of finding optimum pitch. We also worked with Mary to reduce the rate of her speech and also to find a phonation quality that was stronger and more confident sounding than the breathy voice. And the impact was that she was able then to go back into work and hold incredible presentations, have great impact with internally and externally with clients, and feel like she was really empowered in her voice and what she was saying. So there are 5 things that you can do to tweak your voice, to change how it sounds until you find the sound quality that really matches your brand, that feels aligned with who you are and is a much more truthful representation of you. It's really your authentic voice. But what are those 5 things? So we're going to talk about energy or volume. I prefer the word energy because if we start to talk about volume, people start to think about shouting. And we definitely don't want to do that. Shouting does not create rapport. In fact, it damages rapport. So I want to think about energy. The second thing we're going to talk about is intonation, and that's how your voice goes up and down. Then we're going to talk about pace, so how quickly the words come out. Then we're going to talk about pitch, and we've talked a little bit about that now, but we're going to talk about it a bit more. And then we're going to talk about the sound quality of your voice. So those are the 5 things that you have absolute control over when it comes to your voice. So let's talk about energy first of all. Now, fear has a big impact on the energy with which we speak. So if we're fearful about speaking, 2 things can happen. 1, we get a bit too quiet because we don't really want to be talking about this. And if I say it really quietly, then people won't look at me and I'll just get it out really quickly and then I can sit down. So our volume can really drop. And it's quite annoying, isn't it? Because you are now having to lean in to try and listen to what I'm saying. Equally, at the other end of the spectrum, we can get a little bit loud and it can feel like we're telling everybody off because our sentences get a bit staccato, a bit short, and our energy is a little bit direct, it's a bit linear, and so it can get a bit loud. Now that's masking the fear. So fear can create an impact in 2 ways. 1, it can make us too quiet and then the impact of what we're saying gets lost, or it can make us too loud, make the audience feel like they're being told off, and again, can create this sense can create a lack of impact because we feel like we're being told off and it's not a very pleasant experience. So think about it. Do you notice when you're speaking, people sort of leaning back or leaning away, or maybe even crossing their arms over? If that's the case, there is a possibility that you might be too loud. On the whole, women don't tend to be too loud. We tend to be too quiet. So do you notice people leaning forward when you're speaking or turning their ear towards you? Do you notice them asking you to repeat yourself? Sorry, I didn't get that. Can you say that again? Those kinds of things. If that's the case, then you probably are a little bit too quiet. Now, don't forget, you sound very loud in your head because you're hearing your voice both through the air and through bone conduction. Your audience is only ever hearing your voice through the air. So you always sound louder inside your own head. So just double check that. Look at your audience reaction. Also take some time and ask people, say, do you think I'm a bit loud? Do you think I'm a bit quiet? What's the perception for you? And ask around, ask a few people. Don't just ask your friends and colleagues who are likely to say, no, you're great, because you really want some truthful answers here. So energy is really important. We have to use the right kind of energy in the right environment. So smaller, intimate meeting, less energy. Larger, bigger meeting, then we need to use more energy. So let's talk about intonation. So intonation is the way that our voice moves up and down as we speak. And again, fear can impact here, or dislike of the sound of our own voice, and 2 things happen, again, at the ends of the spectrum. And the first and probably most common one that I see is that we become monotone. So we start to lose the up and down of the voice and everything just comes out at one pace and it comes out on pretty much one note, doesn't go up and down very much. And so it becomes quite difficult and quite boring to listen to over a period of time. Imagine if I talked like this for 20 minutes. It's not very interesting to listen to, is it? So fear can often, and in a business scenario, business settings, that's, I would say, the most common reaction is we become monotone. Now, people stop listening after about 10 minutes generally, unless there's a change of pace or something happens, something interesting occurs. So we need to make sure that our voices are moving up and down in a way that is really impactful with our audience. The other thing that happens, and this happens less often, but I have seen it happen, is that we become overly sing-songy. So our voices go up and down, but with no relationship to what we're talking about. So they're just going up and down as they will, with no relationship whatsoever to what it is we're talking about. And we can sound like a little bit childlike in those scenarios, which we don't want. Or our content can be perceived as silly, even though the content may be amazing. But because it's not congruent with the intonation, because it doesn't match the tones of our voices, our audiences doesn't know how to respond to it. It's a bit like the sound equivalent of smiling when you're delivering bad news. It doesn't make sense to our audience. They don't know which bit to listen to. So we want the right kind of intonation, the right kind of up and down that matches the content that we're talking about. And it really allows your audience to absorb your content quickly and easily, because they can listen to the content and the tone of voice and kind of go, oh, yeah, it means this. Oh, yes, it means that. Rather than going, oh, did she mean this or this? So having the right kind of intonation is very important. I'm going to very quickly mention another kind of intonation here, which is upspeak, which you may well have heard of. So upspeak is when we make everything into a question. So if I said, hello, my name is Emma, it sounds like I don't know whether my name is Emma or it isn't Emma. So can you hear where it goes up at the end of every sentence? It's really quite common. It's more common now than it has been ever before. Partly it's due to television and influences from around the world, but also some women do use it to indicate that they haven't finished speaking so they don't get interrupted. But it makes what they're saying sound like they don't believe in what they're saying. It makes it sound like it's a question, like they're not sure. So the upside of continuing to speak is negated by the downside that speaking like that means you sound like you don't know what you're talking about. So it's not the best scenario. So just pay attention to see if you're somebody who does upspeak. Say your name out loud. Hi, hello, I am, and say your name, and just notice where the tone goes. So we want the tone to be dropping. So intonation is really, really important. We need enough intonation that it's interesting, and we need to make sure that the intonation isn't consistently going up. Now, the next thing is pace. And as I said before, fear can really impact our pace. Often I will see people stand up and they just start speaking really, really quickly to get it all out so that they can sit down and everyone can stop looking at them. And unfortunately, if our pace is too fast, it means that our content is not going to be absorbed, or at least most of it isn't. They might get one or two bits, but they won't get everything that we really need them to pay attention to. Now, conversely, if I now delivered the rest of this video at a pace that was much, much slower, you would very, very quickly start to feel patronized. It's annoying, isn't it? So we want to make sure that our pace is really on point. Now, an ideal pace is somewhere around 150, 160 words a minute. We speak in conversation at about 180 because it's like your turn, my turn, we're talking over each other. That's too fast. So we want to bring it down to around 160 words a minute. And that's roughly the pace at that an audiobook is read at. So we can absorb the content, we can create the images we need to as someone else is speaking. So really important that we get the pace just right, because it allows your audience to absorb all that content that you've spent time working on. So let's talk about pitch. Pitch is the note at which your voice comes out. And a lot of it, as I said before, is determined by anatomy. So a man's vocal tract is generally bigger than a woman's vocal tract. So it means it impacts directly on the pitch of the voice. So the quickest way to explain this is, this is going to show my age. I don't know if you remember ever doing this with glass milk bottles, and you get a series of milk bottles and you fill them up with water at different heights. So the milk bottle that has the least amount of water and the most amount of space in, when you blow across the top of that, you get a very low note. The milk bottle that has the most water and the least amount of space, when you blow across that, you get the highest note. So you can see that space creates lower notes. Yep. And a small amount of space creates a higher note. Physically, men have a larger amount of space in their vocal tract than women do. So naturally, their voices are a bit lower. Their vocal folds are also slightly different in shape and size, and that does impact on the sound as well. And women's vocal tracts are smaller, less space, so the pitch is naturally a little bit higher. But what's really, really important to notice here, so there's some things that we can't change. We cannot change our anatomy, that's fixed. But what's important to note is that tension makes that space even smaller. So if we're anxious about the sound of our own voice, if we're anxious about speaking, if we're anxious about making an impact, the tension in our throat actually decreases the size of the vocal tract and raises the pitch even more. Now, we all have an optimum pitch, as I said before, and that's the pitch where your vocal tract is relaxed, your vocal folds are relaxed, and they're at the right tension, really. That's the best way to say it. They're exactly the right tension. And so you could probably speak for hours without getting tired because you're using your voice at its optimum pitch. So one of the ways, if you feel like when you get up to speak, your voice suddenly goes up a bit and it's much higher in pitch than it was before, or when you're speaking to your family or your friends, one of the best ways that you can release tension here is by yawning. Doing really, obviously not in the meeting, do this before the meeting, but any kind of yawn will really help relax and stretch out all the muscles of the vocal tract. You get an injection of oxygen, it means your brain works better. So yawning can really help you find the optimum pitch of your voice. So the fifth and final thing that impacts on how you sound is the quality of your voice. And there's two vocal qualities that I want to mention here. These are the two most common that I see in my clients. And the first one is the breathy quality. So that's what I mentioned earlier with Mary. So that's when we sound a little bit like Marilyn Monroe doing her Mr. President Happy Birthday song. And it can sound like we're not sure about what we're saying. And it can sound a bit too intimate. It's not really the right kind of vocal quality that we want to be using at work to create this idea that we are an expert in our particular area. So breathy quality isn't going to get you what you want. The second vocal quality that I see very often in people is called vocal fry. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you now. So if I now drop into vocal fry, this is what I sound like. And you will most commonly hear this kind of vocal quality in film stars, pop stars, celebrities, Kardashians particularly. They are key people who created this kind of voice or at least made it very popular at the minute. And the other place, if you live in Britain and you know the House of Lords, you will find it in the House of Lords. So in the House of Lords, what you find is that they have a very upper class British accent and the vocal creak. So it sort of sounds like this. They don't really need to make much effort and everyone needs to listen. So vocal fry is how they communicate. Either way, it doesn't really matter why that's happening. What matters is the impact that it creates. So it can create a sense of condescension and it can create a sense of don't really care or whatever. Now, if we're speaking at work, we never want to be sounding condescending and we never want to sound like we don't care. And vocal fry can give both those impressions. So also, it can also sound like you're not sure. If somebody says, what's the answer to this question? So where are the blue jumpers? On the shelf. Yeah. So we answer questions we're not sure about with a bit of vocal fry instinctively. So we don't want to be sounding condescending. We don't want to be sounding like we don't know what we're talking about. And we certainly don't want to sound like we don't care. So those two qualities are not ideal for using your voice at work. Both of those are impacted by breath. So they both can be corrected by having a stronger breath. And you can see if you've got either of those vocal qualities, you can see if this helps. So you're going to press your hands together in the prayer position and really push them quite firmly together. Try and keep your shoulders nice and relaxed, and then bring your thumbs down so they are resting against your sternum. So the bony bit of where your ribs join together. Yeah. So press your hands firmly together, keeping your shoulders nice and relaxed. Now, if you find your breathy voice or if you find your vocal creak disappears, then it's because you haven't quite got enough breath to support your voice when you're talking without your hands being pressed together. If that's the case for you, drop me a DM and we can sort something out. We can help you out. Okay. So the vocal quality is the last of the 5 things that can really help you tweak your voice so it suits your personal brand and so that you're creating impact. So essentially, what we've talked about today is that there are 5 elements that you have absolute control over. You can change so that your voice sounds authentically like you, so it matches your personal brand, so that it has impact every time you speak, and so that you are perceived as being competent, as being the expert that you really are. and know that you've got control over all of those muscles, of all of that apparatus that helps you sound like the expert that you are. So what did we talk about? We talked about energy or volume. As I said, prefer the word energy. Having the right energy in the right scenario is really going to help make an impact. You don't want your audience having to lean in or lean away because you're too quiet or too loud. Intonation. We want to have the right kind of sing-song intonation so that we don't sound too sing-songy and sound childlike, or that we're monotone and boring. So the content, what we're saying, needs to match whether we're going up and down in our voices, and we want to be trying to avoid upspeak at all costs. Pace. So we need to be speaking around about 160 words a minute, roughly the pace of an audiobook, so our audience has time to absorb all the information that we're talking about. Pitch. We really want to be speaking at our optimum pitch, and tension can increase the pitch of our voice, making us sound even more high-pitched, and that can increase the dislike that we have for our voice. So anything we can do to release tension, yawning is a brilliant way to release the immediate tension around the vocal tract, the better, because then our voices will drop into the optimum pitch and we will sound more expert. And then finally, the sound quality. So we want to be trying to avoid breathy voices and creaky voices, and really having enough consistent breath is the way to achieve that. If you've got more complex issues, do drop me a DM and I will do my very best to help you out. You can check out whether it's a breath issue by pressing your hands together in that prayer position. I hope you found today's video really helpful. And if you want to know just how strong your executive presence is, because your executive presence is a combination of your personal brand, your voice, and what you do at work. If you want to test and see how strong your executive presence is, we have a self-assessment scorecard. And you can take that. It takes a few minutes and you'll get a personalized report describing where you are and what you might need to focus on next. Take care, and we will speak very soon. Bye for now.